BBC One in the East. Now the BBC News with Hugh Edwards and Janine Machin at 10 o'clock.
Tonight at 10, the pressure mounts on Boris Johnson, with more questions about the bill for renovating his Downing Street flat. There are new demands for full details of the way the work was funded, but ministers have been defending Mr Johnson's actions.
It's all been done absolutely correctly. There'll be a Cabinet Office report when they put out their annual accounts, and everyone will be able to see exactly what happened.
Number 10 refuses to say whether Mr Johnson borrowed the money, and Labour is now demanding a detailed explanation.
We haven't had that full and frank explanation from the Prime Minister so far. To be honest, he lied yesterday. That's not good enough.
We'll have the latest from Westminster, where the government is on the defensive on more than one front, also tonight. In India, official figures of deaths from COVID are said to be massively underreported as the country fights against a new surge. Growing evidence that the lockdowns have damaged the language skills of young children across England. An image of the Queen back at work, our first official engagement since the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh.
He's away from Courtois, he scores!
And Chelsea took an early lead in their Champions League semi-final against Real Madrid.
Here in the East, anger over the East-West rail route as campaigners near Cambridge say their villages could be destroyed. And Harlow Hospital's emergency department is rated inadequate after failures in infection control.
Good evening. The pressure on the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, shows no sign of easing. He's facing renewed questions about the funding for renovation work at his Downing Street flat. Mr Johnson's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, has claimed that the Prime Minister planned to get secret donations to pay for the work. But Number 10 said today that the refurbishment costs have been met by the Prime Minister personally. Labour has demanded full details of the way the work was funded, and it's gone a step further by accusing Mr Johnson of lying about the matter. It's not the only issue troubling the government right now. As our deputy political editor Vicky Young tells us, there is some flash photography coming up.
Leading the country and setting the tone for the rest of government. The decisions Prime Ministers make every day in this room have far-reaching consequences for us all. They won't always be right, but criticism of Boris Johnson isn't just about his judgment, it's fast becoming about his integrity. Everywhere they go, ministers are being asked similar questions about their boss's behaviour.
Has the Prime Minister broken the rules, Mr Raab? No.
That refers to the expensive refurbishment of the flat Mr Johnson shares with his fiancée. The Prime Minister's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, says the Tory leader tried to get party donors to secretly pay for the renovations. Labour say it's time to come clean.
Who's given the loan? Who's given the money? Because we need to know who the Prime Minister, who Boris Johnson is beholden to, for who has paid for his furniture, for his sofa, for the bed that he sleeps in. And we haven't had that full and frank explanation from the Prime Minister so far. To be honest, he lied yesterday. That's not good enough.
Downing Street says Mr Johnson personally met the cost of wider refurbishment in this year, but hasn't denied that someone else originally picked up the bill. If they did, the rules say that must be made public.
The reason why we have these rules around transparency is so that the public know who decision makers, up to and including the Prime Minister, what their interests are, and to be clear that they are acting on behalf of the people, on behalf of citizens, on behalf of taxpayers, and that they're not overly influenced by donations or loans or private interests.
Number 10 insists Mr Johnson has acted in accordance with codes of conduct and electoral rules. Many Conservative MPs I've spoken to are keen to downplay the significance of all of this. One minister said Boris Johnson has a knack of getting away with things that others wouldn't. But there is concern that lots of individual, unrelated accusations could combine together and erode trust in the Prime Minister. One of the most damaging accusations Mr Johnson faces is about his views on shutting down the country because of COVID. He denies saying he'd rather see bodies pile high than approve a third lockdown. But sources told the BBC and other media organisations that he did make the remark. It's another question being fired at cabinet ministers.
I don't need to worry about who may have or didn't say what and when. The Prime Minister says he didn't say it. That's good enough for me, because actually saving lives is where it matters, and that's what this Prime Minister's done.
Mr Johnson would rather focus on campaigning ahead of next week's elections, but there are bucket loads of questions still to be answered. And tonight, Downing Street still is sidestepping all of those questions about how the refurbishment of the flat was originally paid for. And Labour has significantly stepped up its attack, not just criticising the government as you'd expect from the opposition, but explicitly accusing the Prime Minister of lying, something that doesn't happen very often, even here in the antagonistic world of politics. Lots of Tory MPs want all of this to blow over, but I just don't think that is going to happen until these questions are answered. And Boris Johnson will be fending more of those off tomorrow in the House of Commons.
Vicky, many thanks again. Vicky Young there with the latest for us at Westminster. Now, in India, official figures show almost 200,000 people have died from COVID-related causes. But independent observers say that the real figures are probably much higher. One account suggests that the deaths recorded by crematoria in Delhi may be double the government figures, which deal only with people who've died in hospital. International aid, including from the UK, has started to arrive to help limit the new surge in infections. Our correspondent Davina Gupta reports now from Delhi.
Lives erased in India, their fate sealed by the pandemic. But even as families seek closure in this crematorium built on a car park in India's capital, Delhi, some are being denied dignity even in their death, as the actual reason of their demise is being buried with them.
50% of deaths are not registered by the government as COVID-19. Our NGO brings bodies to be cremated directly from homes of victims. The government only counts related deaths of victims who die in a hospital.
Underreporting of cases is becoming a problem in India in major COVID hotspots. A public health worker told me that in many cases, they are under pressure to attribute pandemic deaths to a pre-existing disease of the patient and not count them as COVID deaths to help the government save face in this crisis. Experts suggest the actual number of those infected could be 20 times higher than reported.
The enormity, the velocity and the ferocity of India's second surge is something to really take a lesson from for the rest of the world, because the virus curve was so quiet, and then the footsteps of the virus we could not hear, but it just exploded.
And the severity of this wave cannot be silenced. With an unprecedented rush of patients, oxygen and essential medical supplies are running out in the city.
My father is in a very critical condition. I'm getting no help. Numbers are given there, but nobody is responding. Numbers are not reachable. Please help me, please. My father is dying. I can't afford another loss. Yesterday I lost my younger brother.
Global aid has started to come. A shipment from Britain, including 100 ventilators and 95 oxygen concentrators, arrived today. But as India struggles with the reality behind the hidden numbers, much more is needed for those fighting for a chance to survive. Davina Gupta, BBC News, Delhi.
Just to let you know that tomorrow the BBC is bringing you a special day of coverage of that deepening coronavirus crisis in India and its significance for the global fight against the pandemic. We'll have reports, we'll have interviews and analysis across TV, radio and our digital platforms throughout the day. Well, let's look now then at the latest official figures in the UK. They show that there were 2,685 new infections in the latest 24-hour period, which means an average of 2,332 new cases per day in the past week. There are just over 1,600 people in hospital with coronavirus. The number continues to fall. 17 deaths were recorded in the past 24 hours of people who'd had a positive COVID test within the previous 28 days. The average number number of deaths per day in the past week is 21. The total number of UK deaths is now 127,451. Let's have a look then at the vaccination position, because a total of nearly 34 million people have now had their first jab. The overall number who've had their second jab is now 13.2 million. Well, let's talk to our health editor, Hugh Pym, who joins me now. Let's talk about the ages of those who are eligible for the vaccinations, Hugh, and those ages are coming down rapidly.
Yes, Hugh, it was only a few weeks ago we were warned that because of supply disruption, the amount of first doses might be severely limited in April, with 40-year-olds and younger only being offered a first jab from May. But things have moved quite a lot faster than we expected. So let's look at the situation as of now. From today, in England, those aged 42 and over will be offered a first dose by text or email. In Northern Ireland, it's already 35 and over. In Wales, those as young as 30 and over are being offered a first jab, and in Scotland, it's 45-year-olds and over.
So, as we look at those figures and the ages coming down, as you say, what are the implications now for the overall rollout of the vaccine?
Well, looking at figures as of the end of last week, you can see the percentage of the entire adult population in each of the nations who've had a first dose. And in Wales, ahead at 68% of the adult population, England 63%, Scotland 62%, and Northern Ireland 61% of adults with a first dose. We also learned today that a quarter of all UK adults have had a first and second dose. So the vaccination programme is going pretty well. There's quiet confidence amongst ministers. Deaths and hospital admissions have fallen 20% week on week in the UK. The interesting thing is to see how it rolls out down to the younger age groups, what sort of enthusiasm there'll be for having the vaccine.
Hugh, many thanks once again. Hugh Pym there, our health editor. Let's stay with the impact of the pandemic, because there's growing evidence that the COVID lockdowns have damaged the language skills of young children in England. The BBC has seen evidence that reduced social interaction, the wearing of face coverings, have deprived youngsters of experiences that are essential for developing their vocabulary. Our education editor, Bronwyn Jeffries, has been to Blackpool and to Walsall to investigate.
Hey, I found a word.
This is how children learn words, but new experiences have been limited by the pandemic. Parents know toddlers have seen and heard less.
At this point, she spent half of her life in lockdown. So, whereas we'd normally do singing groups and toddler groups, she's not had any of that.
They need to be with other children, and, you know, it's good for them, isn't it? Yeah, making new friends and stuff.
It's easy to think with children this little that they haven't missed out on much and they've got plenty of time. But if they don't have the experiences, don't learn the words they need to understand the world, they'll carry that with them throughout their schooling. Katie is one of Blackpool's community connectors, trained to support parents.
Some of the mums and dads actually that I've spoken to have said that they've noticed their children are quite scared around other children. One in particular saying her little one heard another baby cry and didn't know what the noise was, so was quite startled by it.
She's been visiting Darren and Lucy at home with baby George, born in lockdown, and 2-year-old Ruby, worrying their kids have been missing out.
As a nation, we've kind of forgot about how important it is for these children to be out there and developing these skills young, because majorly George, it's impacted the most with him being so young. It's the new normal for him to see people in masks, so he's not quite used to seeing people's faces.
They will be missing a whole amount of skills that we need them to have.
Meryl Davis leads Blackpool's work on very young children. She fears problems have been missed. Health visitors haven't seen families at home. In many areas, they've been moved to other work.
These children are the forgotten children of the pandemic. They definitely are. They're the ones that we've completely overlooked, and the ones who, in a few years' time, when they go to school, won't have the skills that we expect them to have to be able to engage in education.
Good looking, good.
For these 4- and 5-year-olds, there is extra help, a special programme of working with words. Here, it's helped children make months of progress.
We were absolutely amazed to find that some of the children who did only have a few words were able to start to talk in sentences in a matter of weeks.
Well, that's giant.
Catch Up Cash from the government is spreading this approach. By next year, it should be in most of England's primary schools. But many fear unless toddlers are helped too, schools could be dealing with children's word gap for many years. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News.
And if you'd like more advice on how to support your child's early years development, you can visit the BBC's Tiny Happy People website, and plenty of activities and ideas there for you to look at. Now, the BBC understands that most of the Democratic Unionist Party's assembly members at Stormont have signed a no-confidence motion in their party leader, Arlene Foster. Mrs Foster has led the DUP and has been Northern Ireland's First Minister for over 5 years. The DUP has said it will not comment on internal party processes. Our Ireland correspondent, Emma Vardy, has the story.
Appearing unfazed by the bubbling dissent in the party that was about to surface, Arlene Foster brushed off suggestions today that her leadership was in trouble as she visited a local youth centre.
Stories on leadership come up from time to time, and it's one of those times, so we'll just deal with it and move on, because I have bigger things to do, including getting us through this COVID pandemic.
Arlene Foster's overseen a bruising period for the party.
He is a fabulous friend to the union and a promoter of the...
After championing Boris Johnson, the DUP were cast aside as he agreed a Brexit deal which placed barriers to trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. A sense of betrayal over Brexit is among the issues driving loyalist protests on the streets. And a feeling that Arlene Foster and her deputy Nigel Dodds have overseen one of the most damaging periods for unionism in the party's history.
We heard today people saying that there was no support within the unionist and loyalist community to stand up against this protocol. We are not giving our country up, and see, when we say we'll resist this, we mean it.
This anger on the streets has increased the pressure on the party.
I think people are starting to come to the conclusion that they're electorally maybe better off with somebody else than Arlene Foster, because I think they're going to have a lot of difficult questions to answer on the doors next May, particularly around that protocol.
Tonight's motion calls for a leadership election, as Arlene Foster's position looks more untenable by the hour. It is an unprecedented moment for the normally disciplined DUP, now turning on its own. Well, we understand about 3/4 of the DUP's representatives at Stormont and Westminster have signed this, which represents a pretty dramatic collapse of confidence in Arlene Foster's leadership. Now, certainly the party has one eye on the Stormont elections coming up next year and wants to shore up its support ahead of this. But at the same time, don't forget, look, power sharing here at Stormont is fragile, and there will be those who worry that any change in leadership could be particularly destabilising at what is already a difficult time for Northern Ireland.
Emma, many thanks once again for the latest there. Emma Vardy at Stormont. An inquest into the deaths of the 2 people killed by the convicted terrorist Usman Khan near London Bridge in 2019 has heard how he'd been involved in extremist bullying in prison. It also emerged that Khan had been allowed to travel unaccompanied on the day of the attack from Stafford to London, despite the fact that he was meant to be monitored by a government agency. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Daniel Sanford, has more details.
Making his way to London to kill, Usman Khan, a recently released convicted terrorist travelling alone on a train. The police and probation officers who were managing him knew about the journey and allowed it to happen. 5 hours later, in the aftermath of his attack, armed officers had to shoot him dead on London Bridge. He had just murdered Saskia Jones and Jack Merritt. Usman Khan had been jailed for trying to set up a terrorist training camp. During his 8 years in prison, he'd been classified as Category A high risk throughout. Early on, there was intelligence that he wanted to die and go to paradise. He was involved in multiple attacks in prison, including one on a Christian inmate who refused to convert. As he came up to his release, officers were informed he might have deliberately told lies about his rehabilitation. He was also observed mixing with Michael Adebolajo, the killer of Lee Rigby. But the prison service had to release Khan, and for a year he lived quietly in Stafford, only starting to buy things for his attack once he knew he was travelling by himself to London. The jury was shown minutes of meetings of the multi-agency or MAPA panel that was supposed to be managing the risk that Usman Khan might still pose after his release from prison. The minutes note that Khan was coming to London to the event here at Fishmongers Hall, but they record no discussion of the risk he might pose by travelling here alone. On the last day before he travelled, Khan made his final preparations, drawing cash to buy the knives for the attack and purchasing an oversized coat to conceal his fake suicide vest. Daniel Sanford, BBC News at Fishmongers Hall.
Black women face a significantly higher risk of suffering a miscarriage than white women for a range of reasons, according to a new study published in the medical journal The Lancet. The researchers looked at data from more than 4 million pregnancies across 7 countries, including the UK, where it's estimated that at least 1 in 5 women will lose a pregnancy at some point in their lifetime. The study also suggests that miscarriage leaves women from all ethnic backgrounds more vulnerable to long-term health problems. Our global health correspondent, Tulip Mazumdar, has been talking to one woman about her experience.
I remember seeing the positives on the pregnancy test for the first time, and I was just so happy that me and my husband were basically creating life together.
Katie was 28 when she found out she was pregnant, but one day, out of the blue, she started bleeding heavily and she lost the pregnancy.
I just felt, so low, so hopeless, and literally just felt like my world had ended.
Katie was advised to try again and did become pregnant within a few months, but once again the pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Both were second trimester losses.
It was like a blanket of heaviness over my whole body, over my mind, like a dark cloud. I just couldn't see any hope for a long time. So these are the memory boxes that we received at the hospital, so I'm so grateful for.
Katie says she feels much stronger now to be able to talk about her losses, but this study found that black women are 43% more likely than white women to have a miscarriage.
We're not sure why miscarriage is more common in black women, but we think it's a combination of factors. We think it's that black women are more susceptible to things like diabetes and hypertension, and those diseases must be well controlled. We also think there may be some social factors and that black women feel reluctant to seek medical help.
The research also saw a greater risk of other health complications for women from all ethnic groups, the more losses they experienced. The risk of suffering with depression was more than twice as likely after 1 miscarriage and 4 times as likely after 2 or more losses. And although the numbers were low, women were still at 4 times the risk of suicide after 1 loss. They were also more vulnerable to developing blood clots and heart problems. Experts are calling for a revolutionary change in miscarriage services so that couples can access specialist support after 1 loss instead of having to wait for at least 3 miscarriages, as is mostly the case in the UK at the moment.
Whilst miscarriage can be a very distressing thing for a woman to go through, it's important to be aware that most women go on to have a perfectly healthy baby. This research brings together what needs to happen, and that is, after 1 miscarriage, we can learn from that by identifying simple things such as a woman stopping smoking, achieving a healthy body weight, or identifying simple medical conditions that can be treated.
What's this? What's this?
Katie is now proud mum to 2-year-old little Maximus after receiving specialist treatment. It's impossible to know for sure whether that's what led to the success of her 3rd pregnancy, but she says she feels extremely fortunate. Tulip Mazumdar, BBC News.
Millions of votes will be cast in Scotland next week on Thursday, May the 6th, in the election for the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood. The most marginal seat in Scotland is Dumbarton, which has been held by Labour since 1999, indeed since the opening of the Parliament itself. The Scottish National Party say that they now have the seat in their sights, as our Scotland editor Sarah Smith explains.
Working out how to vote really matters in a key constituency in the midst of a crucial election, as these voters will help shape Scotland's future. The gym just reopened yesterday. The owner thinks the pandemic should shape political priorities.
I think there needs to be a real key focus on mental health and physical health as well. I think it's key for economic recovery and it's key to saving the NHS as well.
On Scotland's west coast, Dumbarton is central to this election. This is the most marginal seat in Scotland. Labour have a majority of just 109 votes, with the SNP in second place. If the SNP can win seats like this, it could be the key to them securing an overall majority, which would then allow them to claim a mandate for another independence referendum. The constituency of Dumbarton stretches from the former industrial shipbuilding town to the more genteel seaside pleasures of Helensburgh, where people are very aware that this election could determine whether they're going to get a vote in the next few years on Scottish independence. Local businesses hit hard by lockdown are worried. The owners of this tweed shop won't vote for any party that supports holding a referendum within the next 5 years.
I just think these referendums are very divisive, as we've seen with Brexit, and I don't think it's a good thing for the country at this time.
So not never?
No, not never. If there's a majority for it, there's an appetite for it, we can't say no.
The Prime Minister has said he won't allow another independence referendum. Is that fair?
No, but it's timing. It's making sure that we are secure. Children have caught up at school. The hospitals have got rid of the backlog. That's the time to decide.
To see what's at stake, look at the Faslane Naval Base in this Dumbarton constituency, home to the UK's nuclear submarines. The SNP want to remove nuclear weapons from an independent Scotland. Vanilla or cherry? What many voters here really want to make a choice over is how Scotland's governed, and don't think Westminster should stand in their way.
The issues are important to me is to don't be ruled by Westminster.
I feel like we've had reason after reason to just leave Westminster, and I'm fed up.
I like the fact that Scotland's got their own parliament. I don't like it always being decided by English law.
If there is a victory for parties that want another independence referendum, they will demand the right to hold that vote. But the veto in Westminster's hands will not simply melt away. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Helensburgh.
And here's a list for you of all the candidates and parties standing for election in Dumbarton. And you can see that list again if you want, and details about their parties. It's on the BBC News website. Go to the Scotland or the politics sections and you'll see the links there. Now let's take a look at some of the day's other news. The Civil Servants Trade Union, the FTA, has been told that it can bring a High Court challenge against the decision to clear the Home Secretary of accusations of bullying her staff. An investigation last year found that some of Priti Patel's behaviour had breached the ministerial code, but Boris Johnson decided she hadn't and kept her in the post. 5 people have been arrested after police in Warwickshire found a suspected amphetamine lab during a raid near Redditch. Officers from the National Crime Agency and Warwickshire Police discovered what they believed to be a large-scale operation to produce the illegal drug. The government has been defeated for a 4th time in the House of Lords over plans for removing cladding and other fire safety work on high-rise buildings. Peers amended the fire safety bill yet again to try to stop building owners from passing on the costs to leaseholders. The Met Office says that April is on track to be the frostiest in the UK for at least 60 years. There have been already an average of 13 days of air frost, beating the previous record of 11 days back in April 1970. Now, for the first time since the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh,